Silence speaks the truths you avoid. Buddhist teaching. There are moments in life when noise becomes the natural shield we use against ourselves. People fill their days with conversations, distractions, music, entertainment, obligations, and thoughts that never stop moving. Because silence, although peaceful, is also confronting. Silence removes the layers that the mind carefully builds to keep certain truths hidden. Silence strips away the stories we invent to justify our behavior, our fears, our desires, and our pain. Silence brings to the surface everything that is unresolved, everything we try to ignore, and everything we avoid looking at directly. In Buddhist wisdom, silence is not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. It is the space in which truth becomes visible, the mirror in which the mind sees itself without distortion, and the ground where suffering begins to dissolve because it can finally be recognized. In a noisy world, silence becomes a spiritual refuge. But at the same time, it becomes a doorway to deep transformation. When a person learns to be in silence, not as a punishment or an escape, but as a conscious practice of returning to the essence, life begins to reorganize from within. The mind becomes clearer, the heart becomes lighter, and the soul becomes more aligned with what is real. Silence teaches what books cannot teach and reveals what words cannot describe. It is the teacher that waits patiently behind all the external noise, ready to show the truths that an untrained mind tries to escape. This text invites you on a journey into the kind of silence that heals, reveals, transforms, and liberates. The kind of silence that Buddhism describes as the doorway to wisdom. The kind of silence that does not demand effort, but honesty. The kind of silence that gives you back to yourself. Below, you will explore 5 deep topics, each expanding on how silence speaks, what it reveals, why it matters, and how it becomes a powerful instrument of spiritual awakening. Let this path guide you into your own inner quiet, into the truths you may be avoiding, and into the peace that emerges when you stop running from what is already inside you. Silence reveals the mind's hidden attachments. Silence is often misunderstood as a passive state, a blank space, or a void without meaning. Yet, in Buddhist understanding, silence is a powerful presence. It is alive, dynamic, and deeply revealing. When all external distractions fade, and the mind is no longer fed by the constant stimulation of the world, something unexpected begins to happen. The truth appears. One of the first truths that silence reveals is the hidden network of attachments that governs a person's life. These attachments are not always visible in daily routines because noise acts as a curtain that conceals them. Without the constant hum of activity and distraction, the mind finally shows what it clings to and why. Attachments manifest in many forms. Some are obvious, like attachment to material possessions, status, validation, comfort, pleasure, or security. Others are more subtle, like attachment to identity, beliefs, expectations, emotional patterns, routines, and even suffering. Buddhism teaches that suffering originates from attachment, and yet most people walk through life completely unaware of the subtle strings that pull their actions, reactions, emotions, and decisions. Silence, however, makes these strings visible. It reveals the internal mechanisms that noise keeps hidden. It exposes what the mind fears losing and what it believes it needs to survive. And it shows that many of these attachments are illusions constructed by the ego. When a person sits in silence, the mind begins to show its restlessness. Thoughts appear with force, memories, desires, worries, judgments, fears, and fantasies. The mind jumps from one thing to another, resisting the stillness, because stillness means exposure. Many people believe that silence is uncomfortable because they are not used to it. But the deeper truth is that silence is uncomfortable because it reveals the truth of what is happening inside. The discomfort is not in the silence itself, but in the confrontation with the self. silence unmasks attachments by removing everything that normally distracts from them. A person may think they are peaceful until they sit in silence and realize that they depend on noise to avoid their own thoughts. They may think they are free until silence shows them the fears they try to bury. They may think they are strong until silence reveals their insecurities. They may think they have let go of the past until silence brings old emotions to the surface. This exposure is not a punishment, but an opportunity. The moment attachments become visible, they lose power. What is hidden controls you. What is seen can be transformed. Silence becomes a mirror in which the roots of suffering appear with clarity. When a person stops resisting the internal revelations brought by silence and instead observes them with awareness, transformation begins. For example, silence may reveal an attachment to approval. A person may notice how restless they become when there is no one around to validate their existence. They may realize how their thoughts gravitate toward imagining what others think of them. Without external voices, they begin to notice how deeply they depend on recognition. And they may finally admit that this attachment drives many of their actions. The revelation may be uncomfortable, but it is liberating because it opens the door to freedom. Silence also reveals attachment to control. Many people believe they are calm, patient, or flexible, but silence exposes the anxious need to predict, plan, and manipulate outcomes. When silence removes external stimulation, the mind's desire for control becomes evident. Thoughts arise demanding certainty, clarity, direction, and guarantees. Silence does not provide these. Instead, it shows the mind's discomfort with surrender. This is a profound moment of awakening. When a person realizes that their suffering comes from resisting what they cannot control, silence becomes not an enemy, but a teacher, showing the path toward acceptance. Another attachment that silence reveals is attachment to identity. People spend years building a sense of self through labels, roles, preferences, past experiences, achievements, and social positions. But silence dissolves these illusions. When a person sits without performing any role, without being watched, without engaging with others, the familiar sense of identity begins to fade. They may wonder, who am I when I am not doing anything? Who am I when I am not defined by others? Who am I when I am not performing a persona? Silence reveals that identity is not solid. It is a collection of narratives. When these narratives fall away, what remains is presence, awareness, and pure existence. This is one of the most profound insights of Buddhist practice. The self you cling to is not the self you truly are. Silence also brings attention to emotional attachments. Emotions that were suppressed or ignored begin to surface. Past hurts, unresolved grief, lingering resentment, and even guilt emerge from the depths of the mind. Many people avoid silence because it brings these emotions back into awareness. But from the Buddhist perspective, this is an essential step toward healing. Emotions that are pushed away continue to influence behavior unconsciously. Silence brings them into the light so they can be acknowledged, understood, and ultimately released. The liberation that follows is not theoretical. It is visceral. A person begins to feel lighter, freer, and more grounded, not because silence removed their pain, but because silence allowed them to face what was previously avoided. The revelation of attachments through silence is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process, a gradual deepening of awareness. As a person practices silence regularly, they begin to identify new layers of attachment, some so subtle they were previously invisible. They may notice attachment to comfort, to routine, to being right, to expectations of how life should unfold, or even to spiritual progress. Yes, even spiritual growth can become an attachment when the mind wants to achieve enlightenment as a possession, rather than allowing wisdom to unfold naturally. Silence reveals this as well. It shows when the ego disguises itself as spirituality. Over time, as attachments become clearer, the mind gradually loosens its grip. This is not achieved through effort, but through awareness. When you see the truth transforms you. Silence becomes a sacred space where the mind learns to let go. This letting go is not forced. It happens naturally as the mind recognizes the suffering that attachment creates. It becomes clear that clinging brings pain, while release brings peace. The person begins to see that they do not need to hold on so tightly, that life flows more harmoniously when they allow things to be as they are. Silence teaches surrender, not through words, but through direct experience. When a person embraces silence fully, attachment begins to dissolve. The ego's grasp weakens, fear loses intensity, desire becomes less consuming, worry loses its authority, expectations soften, identity becomes less rigid, the mind becomes spacious, like a clear sky after a storm. In that space, wisdom arises, compassion deepens, presence becomes natural, and the person begins to experience the world without the distortions created by attachment. This is not theoretical spirituality, but lived transformation. Silence reveals attachments, but it also reveals the self beyond attachments. It shows that beneath all the layers of clinging, fear, desire, and identity, there is a deeper essence that is naturally peaceful, steady, and free. This essence is not created by silence, it is discovered through silence. It was always there, but noise prevented its perception. When the mind becomes quiet enough, a person recognizes their true nature. They are not their fears. They are not their thoughts. They are not their past. They are not their roles. They are awareness itself, a presence that observes everything without being defined by anything. This realization is the beginning of spiritual freedom. The first truth that silence speaks is this: you are attached to many things that do not define you and do not bring you peace. When you see these attachments clearly, you begin the process of liberation. Silence does not judge you for your attachments. It simply shows you what is real, and when you see what is real, you change. If you reach the end of this topic and want to continue receiving teachings that deepen your inner peace and self-understanding, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next lessons. The silence that confronts your inner resistance. Silence has a unique way of exposing the parts of ourselves that we spend years trying to escape. While the first revelations of silence often show our attachments and fears, the second truth that silence speaks is far more unsettling: the truth of resistance. Human beings are masters at resisting what is painful, uncomfortable, or uncertain, even when that resistance itself becomes the primary source of suffering. Silence does not create resistance, it simply uncovers it. In the absence of external noise, the mind's internal barriers become unmistakable. The walls we build to protect ourselves from discomfort begin to show their cracks. The illusions we maintain about what we can handle and what we cannot begin to dissolve. Silence reveals how much of our suffering is self-constructed through resistance, avoidance, and denial. It exposes what we do not want to feel, what we do not want to admit, and what we refuse to face in ourselves. To sit in silence is to sit with every part of the self, both the parts we embrace and the parts we reject. The human mind naturally gravitates toward pleasure, comfort, and familiarity, and it instinctively turns away from pain, uncertainty, and vulnerability. But spiritual growth requires meeting reality exactly as it is, not as we wish it to be. Silence forces us into that meeting. When external distractions fall away, resistance becomes louder than ever. The mind begins to fight the stillness. Thoughts surge like waves crashing against rocks. Emotions rise with intensity. The body becomes restless. The urge to move, check something, talk, think, or distract grows. This is the mind's defense mechanism in action. Silence highlights how deeply conditioned we are to run from ourselves. But every moment of resistance contains a hidden truth, and silence gives us the opportunity to finally see it. One of the first forms of resistance that silence exposes is emotional resistance. Many people carry unresolved emotions within them. Grief they never grieved, anger they never acknowledged, fear they never expressed, sadness they never allowed themselves to feel. These emotions do not disappear simply because they are pushed away. Instead, they stay buried, shaping behavior and perception from the shadows. Silence brings these hidden emotions to the surface, not to torment, but to liberate. Yet the mind resists because feeling deeply is frightening. It feels vulnerable, uncontrollable, unpredictable. Silence confronts this resistance by revealing the truth that the pain we avoid is often far smaller than the pain created by avoiding it. For example, a person may carry unresolved grief from the loss of someone they loved. They fill their life with noise to avoid feeling the emptiness or confronting the memories. When silence settles, the ache in the chest emerges. The memories arise. The longing appears. The sadness becomes undeniable. The immediate reaction is resistance, tightening of the body, rapid thoughts, the urge to escape. But if the person stays, if they let silence hold the sadness instead of resisting it, something remarkable happens. The sadness stops being a monster and becomes a truth. It becomes something that simply wants to be acknowledged, something that wants to pass through rather than be imprisoned. The emotion that once felt unbearable begins to soften. Silence becomes a healer by allowing the person to face what resistance kept hidden. Emotional resistance weakens through awareness, not force. Another profound form of resistance that silence reveals is resistance to change. Humans cling to familiarity even when it harms them. They cling to routines, identities, relationships, fears, and patterns because the unknown feels threatening. When silence removes external distractions, the truth becomes clear. Much of our suffering comes not from life itself, but from our refusal to let go of what we have outgrown. Silence brings to the surface the realizations we already know, but avoid accepting. It shows us the relationships that no longer align with our growth. It shows us the habits that drain our energy. It shows us the fears that prevent us from moving forward. It shows us the dreams we abandoned because of self-doubt. It shows us the truth we pretend not to see, and the mind resists. It invents excuses. It rationalizes. It clings to the familiar story. But silence gently insists, the truth is here, whether you accept it or not. Many people fear silence because they fear the truths about their lives that silence will expose. They fear realizing that they are unhappy. They fear realizing that a relationship is over. They fear realizing that they need to change. They fear seeing their own patterns clearly. Silence shines a light on everything we attempt to hide from ourselves. And yet, the purpose of this exposure is not to judge, but to free. Resistance keeps us trapped in cycles of suffering, but awareness dissolves resistance. When we stop fighting the truth and instead allow it to be seen, the fear around change diminishes. The unknown becomes less threatening. The mind begins to understand that change is not the enemy, but the path toward inner liberation. Silence also exposes resistance to stillness itself. We live in a world that glorifies productivity, movement, and constant engagement. Doing is valued far more than being. As a result, many people become uncomfortable when they are not doing anything. The moment they sit still, guilt, anxiety, or restlessness arises. Silence reveals this discomfort. It shows how deeply conditioned we are to believe that our worth is tied to our activity. It exposes the internal pressure to be constantly busy, to constantly achieve, to constantly prove something. This is one of the most pervasive forms of resistance in modern life, the resistance to rest. Silence confronts this belief by showing that being is not only enough but essential for inner peace. When the mind becomes accustomed to silence, it learns that stillness is not laziness but nourishment. Another form of resistance that silence uncovers is resistance to self-honesty. Many people lie to themselves without realizing it. They distort their motivations, desires, emotions, and intentions because the truth feels too painful or too inconvenient. Silence removes the layers of self-deception. It becomes impossible to pretend you are fine when the quiet exposes your sadness. It becomes impossible to pretend you do not care when the stillness reveals your longing. It becomes impossible to pretend you are at peace when silence shows your inner conflict. It becomes impossible to pretend you have moved on when silence reveals the lingering attachment. Silence is uncompromisingly honest. It speaks the truth you try to avoid, and the mind resists because truth demands transformation. To sit in silence is to sit with the truth of who you are in this exact moment, without filters, without distractions, without lies. It is to see your strengths and flaws without the mask of ego. It is to see your desires and fears without distortion. It is to see your hopes and regrets with clarity. This confrontation is one of the most powerful spiritual experiences a person can have. It is the beginning of awakening. But the mind resists because awakening requires courage. It requires releasing illusions, confronting shadows, and embracing vulnerability. Silence is the space where this inner work becomes possible. Resistance arises not because silence is dangerous, but because transformation is profound. Silence also brings forward resistance to forgiveness. Many people hold on to resentment, bitterness, or anger because letting go feels like giving up power. They cling to old wounds because they believe the wound protects them from being hurt again. But silence reveals the truth that holding on to pain is a form of self-imprisonment. In the quiet, anger loses its fuel. Resentment begins to feel heavy. The stories that kept the pain alive start to crumble. The mind resists forgiveness because forgiveness requires releasing the identity built around suffering. Silence shows that the cost of holding on to anger is far greater than the cost of letting go. It reveals that forgiveness is not weakness, but liberation. Yet resistance fights to keep the familiar pain because the ego fears who it will become without the story of hurt. Silence gently asks, "Who are you beneath the resentment?" Another truth that silence exposes is resistance to self-compassion. People can be extraordinarily harsh toward themselves. They judge themselves for mistakes, punish themselves for failures, and criticize themselves relentlessly. When silence removes external noise, self-criticism becomes more audible. The inner voice that has been ignored or normalized begins to reveal itself. Many people are shocked to realize how cruelly they speak to themselves. But silence also reveals the possibility of a different voice, a softer one, a wiser one. The mind resists self-compassion because compassion feels unfamiliar, vulnerable, and undeserved. Yet silence shows that harshness does not lead to growth. It only deepens suffering. The truth spoken by silence is that healing begins when you stop resisting kindness toward yourself. When you allow the inner voice to soften, the heart begins to open. As silence continues to work on the mind, deeper resistances begin to surface. One of the most challenging is resistance to impermanence. Everything in life changes, yet humans desperately try to hold on to what is temporary. They cling to relationships, identities, phases of life, and even moments of happiness because they fear loss. Silence reveals this fear. It brings into awareness the fragility of all things. It exposes the mind's desperate attempts to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. This confrontation can be painful because it forces us to acknowledge that we cannot control time. But silence also brings clarity. The fear of impermanence is what prevents us from fully experiencing the present. When resistance softens, The beauty of each moment becomes visible. Impermanence stops being a threat and becomes a teacher. Silence reveals that the present is the only truth, and that clinging to the past or future is a form of suffering. Another profound resistance that silence uncovers is resistance to inner stillness, because inner stillness reveals meaning. Many people avoid silence because silence challenges the emptiness they feel. When the noise fades, the lack of purpose becomes visible. The question, "Why am I here?" rises from within. The question, "What truly matters?" emerges. The question, "What am I doing with my life?" becomes unavoidable. Silence exposes the places where we have abandoned ourselves. It shows the dreams we forgot, the values we compromised, and the paths we did not take. The mind resists this awareness because it fears the consequences of truth. If I see what I truly want, I may have to change my life. If I see where I am betraying myself, I may have to make difficult decisions. Resistance arises, not because truth is harmful, but because truth demands alignment. Silence asks, are you living the life you want, or merely the life you settled for? The more a person practices silence, the more familiar they become with their own resistance patterns. They begin to notice the moments when the mind tenses, when thoughts become defensive, when emotions surge as protection, when excuses arise automatically. This awareness weakens resistance. It no longer controls unconsciously. Instead, resistance becomes a doorway to deeper understanding. Every moment of resistance becomes a question. What am I afraid to feel? What am I refusing to accept? What truth am I avoiding? Silence teaches that behind every resistance there is a truth waiting to be acknowledged, and behind every truth there is freedom. Over time, silence transforms resistance into surrender. Not surrender as weakness, but surrender as openness. Surrender to the present moment, surrender to truth, surrender to vulnerability, surrender to impermanence. Surrender to the self that exists beneath all conditioning. This surrender is not passive. It is an active embrace of reality. It is the end of the internal fight. When resistance dissolves, the mind becomes spacious, the heart becomes lighter, and peace becomes natural. Silence does not eliminate challenges from life. It simply removes the suffering created by resisting what is already here. The second truth that silence speaks is this: you resist far more than you realize, and your resistance is the root of much of your suffering. When you learn to sit with silence, when you allow resistance to arise without escaping it, the walls begin to crumble. You begin to see yourself clearly. You begin to feel deeply. You begin to accept what you cannot change. You begin to embrace what you have avoided. And in that acceptance, transformation occurs. You are no longer controlled by unconscious resistance. You become aligned with reality. You become free. If this topic brought you clarity, insight, or inner calm, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next teaching that can support your spiritual growth. Silence as the mirror of truth. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of what is real. When all external layers of noise, thought, and distraction fade, silence becomes a mirror that reflects everything without distortion. It does not lie, it does not flatter, and it does not justify. It shows life exactly as it is, and it shows you exactly as you are. This is why silence is both sacred and unsettling. It exposes the truth, and truth has never been comfortable. It strips away illusions, identities, and defenses until only the essence remains. In Buddhist understanding, truth is not something you invent. It is something you uncover. Silence is the tool of that uncovering. It reveals not only the nature of the world, but the nature of the self. And through that revelation comes liberation. When you allow silence to deepen, you begin to see how much of your life is constructed around avoiding truth. The human mind is skilled at weaving narratives, excuses, and beliefs that protect it from reality. It tells itself stories to justify pain, to maintain identity, to sustain illusions of control. These stories are built on noise, the inner commentary that never stops. But when silence settles, these stories lose their power. They cannot survive without constant reinforcement. The mind begins to fall quiet, and in that quiet, the truth begins to rise. You start to see the difference between what you believe and what is actually there. The difference between what you say you are and what you truly are. The difference between what you want to see and what is undeniably real. Silence does not create truth. It simply reveals what was hidden beneath the noise of self-deception. One of the first truths silence reveals is that most of what we call thinking is not genuine reflection, but distraction. The mind believes it is searching for understanding, but often it is merely circling around fear. It repeats worries, desires, judgments, memories, and fantasies endlessly, producing movement that feels like progress but leads nowhere. Silence interrupts this pattern. It halts the mechanical spinning of thought, and in that stillness, awareness arises, the ability to observe thought without being consumed by it. You begin to see that you are not your thoughts, and that the mind's constant commentary is not truth. This realization is foundational in Buddhist practice. The one who observes thought is deeper than thought itself. Silence introduces you to that observer, the awareness behind the noise. It is there that truth begins to speak. When the observer becomes stronger, the illusions of identity begin to weaken. You start to notice how much energy you invest in maintaining the idea of me, a fragile construct built from memory, opinion, comparison, and social roles. Silence dissolves that construct. Without conversation, without external reflection, without performance, the me you defend becomes transparent. You begin to see that it is only a story, not an essence. The more deeply you enter silence, the more you understand that identity is fluid, impermanent, and ultimately empty. This does not mean you cease to exist. It means you stop confusing yourself with the mask you wear. The truth, spoken by silence, is that your essence cannot be defined by name, history, or appearance. It is the awareness that witnesses all of these passing forms. You are not the story. You are the space in which the story unfolds. This realization brings both freedom and fear. Freedom because the burden of constantly protecting and proving your identity begins to fade. Fear because the ego interprets dissolution as death. Silence challenges the ego's dominance by refusing to feed it. The ego lives on noise, opinions, arguments, achievements, recognition. It needs attention to exist. Silence withdraws that attention. It starves the ego. This is why silence can feel threatening. It dismantles the structures that the ego depends upon. But what dies in silence is not the self. It is the illusion of separation. When the illusion fades, what remains is unity, presence, and peace. You discover that the silence within you is the same silence that pervades the universe. It connects everything. It is not emptiness. It is fullness without form. As silence deepens, it also reveals the truth of impermanence. Every sound, thought, and emotion arises and fades within it. Nothing stays. The silence remains constant while everything within it changes. This mirrors the truth of existence itself. Life is movement within stillness. Every experience, every relationship, every moment is transient. Silence teaches this not through words, but through direct observation. When you watch your thoughts arise and dissolve without interference, you begin to understand impermanence at a cellular level. You no longer cling to what passes because you see that clinging cannot stop the flow of time. You begin to appreciate the fleeting beauty of each moment. You begin to see that the only thing truly lasting is awareness itself, the silence that contains all movement. Through this recognition, suffering begins to lose its foundation. Most suffering comes from fighting impermanence, wanting things to stay the same, wanting people not to change, wanting to freeze moments of happiness or avoid moments of pain. Silence teaches that all things pass, both joy and sorrow. It shows that trying to hold on to either is futile. When you surrender to impermanence, peace arises naturally. This is the peace of acceptance, the peace that comes from living in alignment with truth. You stop demanding that reality conform to your desires. You begin to flow with it instead of against it. Silence becomes not only a practice, but a way of being, a way of listening to the natural rhythm of life without interference. Another truth silence mirrors is the interconnectedness of all things. When the mind quiets, the illusion of separateness dissolves. You begin to sense that you are not isolated, but part of a vast web of existence. You feel the air you breathe as part of you, the sound of the wind as part of you, the suffering of others as part of you. This awareness of interconnection is not philosophical, it is experiential. Silence makes it tangible. When the mind's barriers fall, the boundary between self and world blurs. Compassion arises naturally from this understanding. You realize that hurting another is hurting yourself, that kindness to others is kindness to your own being. This is why silence is considered sacred in Buddhist practice. It is the space where the illusion of duality dissolves and unity becomes visible. The mirror of silence does not only reveal peace, it also reflects the shadows. It shows you the aspects of yourself that you deny or repress, the anger, jealousy, shame, fear, pride and pain that you project onto others. In silence, there is no one else to blame, no distraction to hide behind. You must face what is within. This confrontation can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it is the essence of purification. By seeing your shadows clearly, you reclaim the energy trapped within them. What was unconscious becomes conscious and therefore transformable. Silence does not judge your darkness. It simply reveals it so that you can integrate it. Every insight gained through silence is an act of returning to wholeness. One of the greatest illusions silence dispels is the illusion of control. When the external world grows quiet, you realize how little control you truly have. Over time, over others, over outcomes, even over your own thoughts. The mind resists this truth, but silence makes it undeniable. You see that life unfolds according to a rhythm larger than personal will. Plans fail, expectations collapse, circumstances shift, and yet life continues to move. Silence shows that peace does not come from control, but from surrender. When you stop demanding that the universe obey your plans, you begin to move in harmony with it. This surrender is not resignation. It is trust. It is the recognition that the same intelligence that makes your heart beat also guides the stars. You realize that you are not separate from that intelligence, you are an expression of it. The truth of silence is paradoxical. It teaches by removing rather than adding. It does not fill you with information. It empties you of illusion. It does not give you something new to believe. It helps you let go of what is false. In the stillness, you begin to see that the truths you seek have always been present, hidden beneath layers of noise. The wisdom of silence is not intellectual, it is intuitive. It speaks through feeling, through awareness, through insight that arises spontaneously when the mind is clear. You do not need to force understanding. It unfolds naturally, like light filling a room when the shutters are opened. The more you rest in silence, the more life itself becomes the teacher. Every moment becomes a revelation. Every breath becomes sacred. Silence also reveals the truth about love. What most people call love is often a mixture of attachment, need, and projection. They love based on what others give them, how others make them feel, or how others fit their expectations. But when silence removes external dependency, you begin to sense love as a state of being rather than an exchange. It is the natural expression of awareness. It is not directed toward one person, but radiates toward all life. In silence, love loses its object and becomes presence itself. You realize that you do not need to seek love because you are made of it. The mind resists this truth because it threatens the ego's narrative of lack. But silence speaks softly. You were never incomplete. You were only distracted. Another profound truth silence shows is that meaning is not something to be found outside yourself. The constant search for purpose often leads to confusion because it is driven by the assumption that meaning exists somewhere in the future or in external achievements. Silence reveals that meaning is already inherent in being. You do not need to chase it. You need only to see it. Every moment of awareness is meaningful. Every act of presence is sacred. When the mind quiets, ordinary experiences, drinking water, walking, breathing, observing light, become extraordinary. The miracle of existence becomes visible. Silence transforms perception so completely that even the simplest moments become expressions of the infinite. As silence deepens, the boundaries of time begin to fade. Past and future lose their grip, and only the present remains vivid. You realize that the past exists only as memory, and the future only as imagination. The only real experience is now. Silence reveals this not as an idea, but as lived truth. When the mind stops moving, you experience the eternal present directly. This is the heart of Buddhist realization. Liberation exists only here, in this moment, in this awareness. The search for peace ends when you stop searching and simply rest in silence. The truth of the present becomes undeniable. You see that nothing is missing, that everything you sought outside yourself was always here, waiting in the quiet. The mirror of silence also shows the imperfection of language. Words, though useful, are limited. They can point to truth, but can never contain it. Silence reveals that ultimate understanding lies beyond expression. Many of the deepest insights in meditation cannot be described. They can only be lived. This is why the greatest teachers often teach through silence, not because they lack words, but because silence communicates directly to the soul. When you sit with another being in silence, something profound happens beyond thought. Presence speaks. Awareness connects. There is a knowing that requires no explanation. Silence becomes the language of the spirit. In daily life, bringing silence into your awareness transforms everything. You begin to listen differently, to others, to nature, to yourself. You no longer listen merely to respond, but to understand. You notice the pauses between words, the space between breaths, the subtle vibrations of existence. Silence makes you sensitive to life. It sharpens perception, deepens empathy, and softens judgment. You realize that wisdom grows not from speaking more, but from listening more. Listening not only with the ears, but with the entire being. Silence trains you to be receptive, to allow truth to emerge rather than forcing it. In that receptivity, peace becomes your natural state. Yet silence also tests commitment. It requires patience. At first, silence may feel uncomfortable, even unbearable. The mind rebels. Thoughts grow louder. Old emotions arise. But if you remain steady, if you continue to sit with the discomfort, the resistance begins to dissolve. What once felt empty begins to feel alive. What once felt frightening begins to feel sacred. Silence transforms from void to presence, from discomfort to clarity, from isolation to unity. It becomes a friend, a teacher, a sanctuary. And within that sanctuary, the truth continues to unfold endlessly. Ultimately, silence reveals that truth is not something to possess, but something to live. You cannot capture it in concepts or hold it in memory. You can only embody it through awareness, compassion, and authenticity. Silence trains you to live truthfully, to act not from fear or desire, but from clarity and love. It teaches you to move through the world without losing the center of stillness within. When silence becomes your foundation, words and actions flow from wisdom rather than reaction. You become like a calm lake, reflecting the sky, untouched by ripples, yet fully alive. The mirror of silence never stops reflecting. Each time you return to it, new layers of truth are revealed. Some truths will free you, others will humble you, all will transform you. And gradually, you begin to realize that silence was never something external. It was never just the absence of noise. It was the essence of who you are. Beneath all thought, all emotion, all identity, you are silence itself, aware, vast, and eternal. The search for truth ends where it began, in the stillness of your own being. If this teaching resonated with you, if it helped you see yourself and life more clearly, remember to subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring these profound insights and deepen your own path toward peace and awakening. The healing power of silence. Silence is one of the oldest medicines known to the human spirit. Long before there were words, rituals, or teachings, there was silence. The sacred emptiness from which all understanding arises. Every spiritual tradition has recognized in its own language that silence possesses the power to heal not only the mind, but the soul itself. Buddhism treats silence as a form of compassion, a way of listening so deeply to life that pain, confusion, and illusion begin to dissolve in awareness. Silence heals not by doing, but by being. It does not fight illness. It removes the noise that prevents the natural harmony of existence from reasserting itself. Healing, in this sense, is not a process of addition, but of subtraction. You do not become whole by acquiring something new, but by allowing silence to clear away everything that obscures your wholeness. When a person enters deep silence, something begins to unwind within them. The mind, accustomed to noise and stimulation, starts to slow. Thoughts lose their urgency. Emotions that were tightly held begin to loosen. The nervous system, long trapped in states of alertness and reaction, starts to settle into calm. This physiological transformation mirrors a spiritual one. Silence allows the fragmented self to reunite. It invites the scattered energies of the body and mind to return to the center. In stillness, the self heals by remembering its natural state. Peace. The Buddha often compared the mind to a lake disturbed by wind. As long as the winds of desire, fear, and thought continue to blow, the water remains agitated and the reflection of reality becomes distorted. When the winds cease, the lake becomes clear again, and the truth of existence reflects itself naturally. That is what silence does. It stills the winds so that truth, and therefore healing, can appear. Most people misunderstand healing as the removal of pain, but in truth, healing is the full acceptance of pain. Silence provides the space where pain can be met without judgment, where it can express itself and complete its cycle. What we resist persists, what we observe dissolves. Pain, both physical and emotional, is a message from life asking to be acknowledged. But when we drown it in distraction or suppress it through activity, the message becomes louder. Silence teaches you to listen to that message instead of running from it. When you sit in silence with your suffering, you begin to see that pain is not an enemy, but a teacher. It points to the places within you that are asking for awareness. Silence heals because it allows awareness to touch what has been abandoned. Awareness is the balm that suffering longs for. At first, this process can feel intense. When you enter silence, everything you have been avoiding surfaces. Memories you buried, emotions you denied, fears you silenced, all rise to be seen. Many people mistake this stage for regression or failure, believing that silence makes things worse. But this is the necessary purification that precedes healing. The pain was always there. Silence only removes the distractions that kept it hidden. The more you remain with it, the more it begins to change form. What once felt unbearable becomes bearable. What once seemed endless begins to move. Healing is not always comfortable, but it is always freeing. Silence creates a container large enough to hold everything without resistance. In that holding, transformation happens naturally. Silence also heals relationships. In silence, the noise of blame, expectation, and misunderstanding subsides. When two people share silence consciously, they begin to hear not each other's words, but each other's essence. True listening, the kind that heals, arises only when the mind is quiet. Often, what breaks connection between people is not disagreement, but the inability to listen. Silence teaches you to listen, not to reply, but to understand. When you bring this kind of presence into any relationship, healing begins. Words spoken from silence carry a different vibration. They are free from ego and defensiveness. They reach the heart instead of the mind. Even unspoken silence can heal. The silence of forgiveness, of acceptance, of simply being present for another's pain without trying to fix it. This is the silence that restores trust and dissolves wounds. Another dimension of silence's healing power lies in the body. Modern science now confirms what ancient wisdom always knew. The state of inner quiet reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, balances the nervous system, and enhances immunity. The body, like the mind, cannot heal while it is in constant motion or defense. Silence activates the parasympathetic system, which is responsible for restoration. But beyond biology, something deeper occurs. When silence permeates the body, awareness begins to inhabit places that were previously numb or tense. You start to feel life energy again. The body and consciousness reunite. The separation between mind and body, which is the root of much illness, begins to dissolve. Healing becomes not an event, but a state of harmony, a return to wholeness. Buddhism teaches that all suffering arises from ignorance, from not seeing reality clearly. Silence heals ignorance because it reveals reality as it is. It allows perception to return to its natural state of clarity. When the mind is noisy, perception is filtered through opinion, judgment, and desire. When the mind is silent, perception becomes pure. You see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. This clarity is the foundation of wisdom. And wisdom is the highest form of healing because it removes the root causes of suffering rather than just alleviating symptoms. To see truth clearly is to be free from confusion, and freedom is health in its most profound form. Silence also heals the illusion of isolation. Many forms of emotional pain, loneliness, fear, anxiety, arise from the belief that we are separate from life. Silence dissolves this illusion. In the absence of mental chatter, you begin to feel the quiet presence of existence itself. You sense the life in your breath, in the air, in the space around you. You realize that you are not separate from this vast intelligence but a part of it. This recognition brings deep comfort and belonging. The loneliness that once seemed unbearable begins to fade, replaced by a sense of unity. The more you enter silence, the more you discover that you were never truly alone. You were only distracted from your connection to all that is. Another powerful aspect of silence's healing is forgiveness. In silence, the heart softens. The stories that fuel resentment lose their intensity. You begin to see that holding on to anger or blame only poisons yourself. Silence teaches that forgiveness is not a moral duty, but a natural consequence of understanding. When you see clearly, you realize that everyone, including yourself, acts from unconsciousness, from pain, from fear. This recognition brings compassion. Forgiveness then arises effortlessly. The heart heals not through revenge or closure, but through the quiet acceptance that life, in all its imperfection, is still sacred. Silence is the space where forgiveness becomes possible. As silence deepens, another layer of healing unfolds, the healing of meaning. Many people suffer not from external circumstances, but from the loss of purpose. Their lives feel fragmented, random, or hollow. Silence restores meaning by reconnecting you to the essence of life itself. When the noise of ambition and comparison fades, the simple miracle of existence reveals itself again. The sound of the wind, the rhythm of your breath, the warmth of sunlight, all become sacred reminders of life's intrinsic value. Silence heals the existential wound by showing that meaning is not something to be created, but something to be remembered. The meaning of life is life itself, experienced consciously. There is also the healing that comes through surrender. In silence, you learn that healing cannot be forced. You cannot command peace, just as you cannot command a flower to bloom. You can only create the conditions for it. Silence creates those conditions. It is the fertile ground in which healing grows on its own. Surrender means allowing the process to unfold without resistance. When you stop demanding results, healing begins to happen effortlessly. This surrender is not passivity but trust. Trust in the intelligence of life, in the body's capacity to restore balance, in the mind's ability to find clarity, and in the heart's natural inclination toward love. Silence teaches you to trust again, to rest in being rather than doing. In moments of silence, intuition awakens. The mind that is quiet becomes receptive to subtle guidance. Answers arise not through logic, but through knowing. Problems that seemed impossible begin to unravel by themselves. The right decisions emerge naturally. This intuitive wisdom is another form of healing because it aligns you with the flow of life. When you are aligned, struggle diminishes. The effort that once felt exhausting becomes graceful. You move with the current instead of against it. Silence reconnects you to this inner compass, the quiet voice of wisdom that has always been there, beneath the noise of thought. The healing power of silence also extends to the collective level. A society that forgets silence becomes sick. Constant stimulation, endless information, and unceasing noise create a culture of anxiety and disconnection. Silence is not only personal therapy, but collective medicine. When groups of people share silence, in meditation, prayer, or simply mindful presence, a field of harmony emerges. This field influences consciousness itself. It softens aggression, dissolves division, and restores empathy. The world does not need more noise to heal, it needs more presence. The silence of one peaceful heart radiates outward, affecting others invisibly but powerfully. Healing spreads through stillness, not through argument. Eventually, silence heals even the fear of death. Death is the ultimate silence, and the ego fears it because it identifies with noise, with activity, identity, and form. But those who have entered deep silence in life have already tasted death in a peaceful way. They have experienced the dissolution of the ego and discovered that what remains is awareness, untouched, eternal, infinite. Silence shows that death is not an end, but a return. The same silence that surrounds your life surrounds your death. It is the same silence that existed before your birth. In this realization, fear fades, death loses its power, and life becomes more vivid. You begin to live fully because you no longer need to resist the inevitable. This is perhaps the deepest healing of all. In the end, the healing power of silence is inseparable from the power of awareness. The two are one. Silence gives awareness the space to operate. Awareness gives silence meaning. Together, they form the essence of spiritual healing, the restoration of harmony between mind, body, and soul. When you live with this awareness, even the noise of the world cannot disturb you. You carry silence within you like a secret sanctuary. You can walk through chaos without losing peace. You can face pain without losing faith. You can meet the unknown without losing trust. This is the true miracle of silence. It makes you whole, and wholeness is health. Silence heals everything that noise cannot touch. It reaches where medicine cannot go, where therapy cannot reach, where words cannot soothe. It speaks directly to the soul in the only language the soul understands. Presence. To sit in silence is to allow life itself to heal you. It is to open yourself to the infinite intelligence that sustains the universe. It is to remember that you are not broken, only disconnected from your own depth. Silence is the bridge back to yourself. It is the return home. If this reflection brought you peace or insight, remember to subscribe to the channel to continue walking this path of awareness and to receive more teachings that nurture your spirit through the timeless wisdom of silence. The enlightenment found in silence. When silence becomes not merely an outer condition but an inner reality, enlightenment begins to unfold. Enlightenment is often imagined as a sudden flash, a mystical revelation, a rare event reserved for saints or sages, but in truth, it is the natural flowering of silence. It is what happens when all resistance, all illusion, all striving fall away, and only presence remains. The Buddha never taught enlightenment as something to be acquired. He described it as the ending of ignorance, the quiet seeing of things as they truly are, and what allows such seeing. Silence. Not the forced quiet of suppression, but the effortless stillness that arises when the mind is no longer at war with itself. In that stillness, awareness expands beyond the boundaries of thought, identity, and time. One begins to perceive life directly, unmediated by the restless commentary of the mind. Silence, therefore, is both the path and the realization. It begins as a practice, and it ends as the essence of who you are. As silence deepens, perception undergoes a radical shift. What once seemed solid begins to appear fluid. The line between observer and observed softens until it dissolves. The wind moves, and you feel it not as something outside you, but as your own breath. The sound of a bird becomes your own heartbeat. The world, once experienced as a collection of separate objects, becomes a single living presence. In that moment, you understand the truth that the Buddha pointed to when he said that form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Everything that exists arises within silence and returns to it. This silence is not void, but fullness, the infinite potential from which all life emerges. To realize this is to awaken to the unity that has always been hidden by noise, yet enlightenment through silence does not come easily. The mind resists dissolution because it fears losing its dominion. It clings to the familiar sense of I that defines its existence. When silence grows too deep, the ego begins to tremble. Thoughts become desperate, emotions surge, memories arise. It is as though the mind, sensing its own impermanence, tries to reassert itself through noise. This is why many spiritual seekers retreat from silence at the threshold of awakening. They interpret the mind's final resistance as danger rather than liberation. But if one remains still, if one allows the turbulence to pass without interference, something extraordinary happens. The sense of a separate self collapses. There is no longer an observer watching the silence. There is only silence aware of itself. This is the heart of enlightenment. Awareness resting in awareness. Existence recognizing its own nature. In such silence, truth reveals itself as self-evident. There is no need for belief, doctrine, or argument. Understanding arises like dawn breaking over the mountains, gradual yet unstoppable. You see that every thought, every emotion, every experience is a temporary ripple on the vast ocean of consciousness. You are not the ripple, you are the ocean. Fear loses its foundation because there is nothing outside you to threaten you. Desire loses its urgency because nothing is missing. The opposites of gain and loss, success and failure, life and death dissolve into a single continuum. Silence teaches you that enlightenment is not an escape from the world, but the full embrace of it. To be enlightened is to see that the divine is present in every detail, in the sound of rain, in the cry of a child, in the rise and fall of your own breath. Silence opens your eyes to the sacredness of the ordinary. The process of awakening through silence also transforms your relationship with thought. The mind does not disappear, it becomes transparent. Thoughts arise like clouds in a clear sky, visible but unsubstantial. You no longer identify with them, you no longer mistake them for truth. You use them when needed, then release them when they have served their purpose. This is the essence of Buddhist mindfulness, to think without being possessed by thought, to feel without being consumed by emotion, to act without attachment to outcome. Silence trains you to live in this balance naturally. You begin to move through the world with effortless grace. The noise of ambition quiets. The compulsion to prove yourself fades. Action flows from clarity, not from craving. This simplicity is the fragrance of enlightenment, the peace that arises when nothing needs to be added or removed. In the light of silence, compassion awakens as a natural expression of wisdom. When the illusion of separation dissolves, you can no longer see another's suffering as separate from your own. Compassion does not arise as a moral obligation, but as the spontaneous movement of the heart. The more silent you become inside, the more attuned you become to the subtle vibrations of others. You sense their pain before they speak. You feel their joy as your own. This sensitivity is not weakness, it is strength. It allows you to act with love rather than judgment. Silence removes the walls that divide you from the world. You become the world, and the world becomes you. The enlightened person does not withdraw from life. They participate more deeply than ever because they see no distinction between inner and outer, self and other, sacred and mundane. One of the great paradoxes of silence is that it reveals that enlightenment was never missing. It was not something to attain, but something to notice. The noise of the mind created the illusion of distance. You believed you were searching for truth, but the seeker and the sought were always one. Silence removes the veil of searching. When the mind stops chasing, the truth stands revealed in the simplicity of being. This recognition can happen gradually or in an instant, but it always carries the same flavor, a quiet joy that does not depend on circumstances. Enlightenment is not a peak to reach. It is the discovery that there was never a mountain. It is the realization that what you are seeking has always been present in the silence from which you came. In deep silence, time loses its meaning. Past and future dissolve into a single continuum of now. The mind, which lives by memory and anticipation, falls silent because it cannot find a foothold in the present. This timeless awareness is the field of enlightenment. You begin to see that life is not unfolding in linear sequence, but happening all at once, an eternal now expressing itself in infinite forms. You become aware that what you truly are has never been born and will never die. The body moves through time, but awareness remains untouched. The fear of death disappears, replaced by profound peace. This peace is not indifference, but intimacy with existence itself. It is the realization that you are the silence behind all beginnings and endings. The enlightenment found in silence also transforms how you relate to suffering. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "What is this showing me?" Every experience becomes a teaching. Every pain becomes a doorway to understanding. Silence teaches that nothing is wasted, not even suffering. The same silence that contains your joy also holds your sorrow, unchanged, unjudging. In that space, suffering loses its grip. It becomes part of the rhythm of existence, a wave that rises and falls, leaving the ocean untouched. You begin to see that enlightenment is not about escaping human experience, but seeing through it. To be fully human is to be fully divine, because both are expressions of the same silence. As this awareness stabilizes, life becomes profoundly simple. You stop chasing meaning because every moment is meaningful. You stop chasing peace because peace is what you are. You stop chasing love because love flows naturally from silence. The endless seeking that once defined your spiritual path ends in quiet laughter, the laughter of recognition. The Buddha smiled not because he escaped suffering, but because he saw through it. He smiled because he understood that the same silence that allows suffering also allows awakening. That smile is the smile of enlightenment, the smile of one who has realized that there is nowhere to go and nothing to attain. Silence is both the path and the destination. Yet enlightenment is not the end of life's unfolding. It is the beginning of true living. The enlightened person still walks, eats, speaks, and works, but everything is infused with awareness. There is no separation between meditation and action, between silence and sound. Every act becomes meditation, every breath becomes prayer. When you live from silence, you move in harmony with existence. You respond to life rather than react to it. Your actions are not driven by fear or desire, but by the natural intelligence of the moment. This is the meaning of right action in Buddhism. Action born from awareness rather than ego. Such living brings deep contentment, for you are no longer divided against yourself, you are whole. In the silence of enlightenment, gratitude arises spontaneously. You begin to see that every experience, pleasant or painful, contributed to your awakening. Every person you met was a mirror reflecting some aspect of yourself. Every loss taught you impermanence. Every joy revealed love. Even the noise you once despised was part of the symphony leading you back to silence. Gratitude flows like a river through the awakened heart. It is not forced or rehearsed, it is natural. You thank life simply because it exists, because you exist, because silence exists. Gratitude becomes prayer without words. As the awareness of silence matures, you start to perceive that even the concept of enlightenment is a temporary construct. It served a purpose, to guide you toward truth. But once you reach silence, the concept dissolves. There is no enlightened person. There is only enlightenment existing without owner. The I that could claim awakening has vanished. What remains is life living itself, awareness aware of itself. This is why the masters speak so little of enlightenment. To name it is to reduce it. To describe it is to confine it. It can only be lived. In deep silence, you understand why the Buddha, when asked about the ultimate truth, often remained silent. His silence was not ignorance, but the highest teaching. It was an invitation to experience rather than conceptualize. When silence becomes your constant companion, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The rustle of leaves, the flow of water, the distant laughter of children, all resonate with a sacred quality. The world no longer appears chaotic, but harmonious. Everything seems to move with perfect timing. This is not because the world has changed, but because your perception has. You see the hidden order in apparent randomness. You see that silence underlies every sound, peace underlies every movement, eternity underlies every moment. This seeing is enlightenment, the ability to perceive the infinite within the finite, the timeless within time, and yet even in enlightenment the journey continues. Life keeps unfolding, revealing ever deeper dimensions of silence. Enlightenment is not a static state, but an ever-expanding awareness. The silence within you continues to deepen, to refine, to encompass more of existence. You become a vessel through which silence expresses itself in countless forms, through words that heal, through actions that serve, through presence that uplifts. The enlightened life is not withdrawal from the world, but participation without attachment. You engage fully, love fully, give fully, yet remain untouched. You are in the world but not of it, because your home is silence. Ultimately, silence and enlightenment are one and the same. Silence is the ground, enlightenment is its flowering. To awaken is to remember that you were never separate from the silence that sustains all things. You were never lost, you were dreaming of noise. When you wake up, the dream dissolves, and what remains is the eternal stillness that was always here. You realize that the silence you touch in meditation is the same silence that holds the stars, the same silence that listens through every heart, the same silence that will receive you when this life ends. Enlightenment is the recognition that there has never been anything but this. Infinite silence dancing as form, awareness playing as life. If this final reflection on silence and awakening brought you peace, understanding, or inspiration, remember to subscribe to the channel. Continue walking this path with us, returning again and again to the sacred stillness within you, where truth, healing, and enlightenment are not distant goals, but the reality of who you already are.